It is now time to listen to the science. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Rajandra Pachauri, Chair of the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, IPCC. So, Dr. Pachauri, you do have the floor.
Your Excellency, Secretary General of the UN, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, Your Excellency, President of Peru, Mr. Ollanta Humala, former President of Mexico, Your Excellency, Mr. Felipe Calderon, former Vice President of the US, Mr. Al Gore, Foreign Minister of Peru, Your Excellency, Foreign Minister of France, and Chairman of COP20, Mr. Manuel Pulgar Vidal. It's a great privilege for me to speak in this extremely important session, because I hope in this session we would be able to crystallize the level of ambition that is required to ensure that we provide coming generations, and including some of the underprivileged in this generation, with a secure future. I'm going to present just a few slides which are drawn from the synthesis report released in the presence of His Excellency, the Secretary General of the UN and Chair of this COP, President of this COP, Minister Pulgar Vidal, on the 2nd of November in Copenhagen. Let me start with the first slide, and this is something that does not require any repetition, because essentially we know that human influence on the climate system is now indisputably clear. And the more we disrupt our climate, the more we risk severe, pervasive, and irreversible impacts. Fortunately, we have the means to limit temperature change and build a more prosperous and sustainable future, because dealing with climate change also carries with it a range of co-benefits that would really lead to a much more sustainable and a better world. This is a picture where essentially we have synthesized information from the 3 working group reports, and you can visually see the linkages over here. The very first diagram tells you about temperature increase. The next gives you increase in sea level, which between 1900 and 2010 was an average of 19 centimeters on an average. And the next picture shows you the increase in greenhouse gas emissions, essentially nitrous oxide, methane, and the green line that you see right at the top, the increase in carbon dioxide emissions, which are growing far more rapidly than was the trend earlier. And the last picture tells you the sources of carbon dioxide emissions. You find that the bulk of it comes from fossil fuels, cement, and flaring. And the shade lower down is essentially the emissions from forest trees, that is essentially deforestation. Now, what I'd like to submit is that continued warming increases the risks of severe, pervasive, and irreversible impacts. But as it happens, risks are unevenly distributed and are generally greater for disadvantaged people and communities in countries at all levels of development. So disadvantaged people in developed as well as developing countries are clearly the most vulnerable. And people who are socially, economically, culturally, politically, institutionally, or otherwise marginalized are especially vulnerable to climate change. So that certainly raises issues of ethics. And this, I think, is an extremely important diagram where we show on the left-hand side, in the shaded bars that you see, the reasons for concern in some of the most critical elements of the global system. The first of these is unique and threatened systems, and this includes biodiversity, species loss, and the second is extreme weather events. What I'd like to highlight over here, and in that I would like to move to the next part of this diagram, which gives you the level of cumulative CO2 emissions that relate to different levels of temperature increase and therefore directly link up with the extent of these reasons for concern. And let me highlight two things over here. Firstly, as you would see, even with the 2-degree increase in temperature, there is reason for concern as far as unique and threatened systems are concerned and extreme events. So even with 2 degrees Celsius, we are not going to get a perfect world. We would certainly have a high level of risks and concern related to unique and threatened systems and extreme weather events. May I also mention another figure from the synthesis report. At 2 degrees Celsius, the scenario that we have for bringing about that level of stabilization, the 2.6 RCP scenario, will still lead to sea level rise at the end of the century in a range of 0.26 meters to 0.55 meters. So let's assume we end up somewhere in the middle of that range, say close to 0.4 meters. That's a substantial increase in the level of the seas. And therefore, I would like to submit for your consideration that to create a secure, safe, and a better world, we cannot possibly think of going above the level of 2 degrees Celsius, because 2 degrees themselves have some of these concerns that are associated with that level. And the last part of this diagram gives you the greenhouse gas emissions, which are linked to the level of carbon dioxide emissions for each of the 4 scenarios that we have measured. So may I submit that it is for us to see where, on ethical, equitable, scientific, and economic grounds, we want to limit temperature increase in the future and thereby limit the reasons for concern, and how we can look at levels of emissions, cumulative emissions, that create those concerns. That's all shown in one diagram over here. What I'd like to also mention is that effective adaptation and mitigation measures will depend on policies and measures across multiple scales: international, regional, national, and subnational. And therefore, I greatly commend the effort to see that we get state as well as non-state actors together, because unless we carry out a comprehensive effort involving everyone, we are clearly not going to reach the level of success that is required. I also want to mention that ambitious mitigation is affordable. Yes, it would be difficult, particularly since we are starting from a trend which essentially represents a very high rate of growth of emissions. It is affordable simply because even with the most stringent mitigation pathway, by 2030, we would get a loss of global consumption, or you could equate it to global GDP, of 1.7% at the median level. And that clearly is not a very high price to pay for the level of mitigation that we need to achieve. Estimated costs of mitigation do not account for the benefits of reduced climate change. So there's a whole range of co-benefits, not only in terms of reduced impacts of climate change, but also in terms of higher energy security, lower levels of air pollution at the local level and several others. But may I also mention that as far as the number of impacts are concerned, we should not try to look at only dollar values or monetized estimates of cost, because clearly these are very difficult when it comes to human lives, cultural heritage, ecosystem services. It's very difficult to value and monetize some of these. And therefore, we really need to look at issues of equity, justice, and fairness. And these arise with respect to mitigation as well as adaptation. Now, different past and future contributions to the accumulation of GHGs are an important part of this, varying challenges and circumstances, and of course, different capacities to address mitigation and adaptation. This has to be an essential part of the solutions that we are looking for. And we know that options for equitable burden sharing can reduce the potential for costs of climate action to constrain development. The point I'd like to make is that efficiency and equity are important drivers of coming up with solutions that are going to be most cost-effective. Now, I'd like to stop with this final picture. May I say that this is a remarkable innovation that we have come up with in the 5th assessment report. This represents the budget in terms of emissions of carbon dioxide that would ensure or give us a high level of assurance of keeping temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius. This total carbon budget was 2,900 gigatons of CO2. By 2011, we had used up 1,900 gigatons already. We are left with 1,000 gigatons, and therefore, whatever commitments we make will obviously erode the amount of space we have available in terms of the budget for CO2 emissions. So I'd like to end by submitting that we're all on spaceship Earth. We are now sharing this space of the budget of 1,000 gigatons of CO2. And I think we have to divide up this space equitably and in a manner of fair and ethical considerations, because otherwise we are going to exceed the 2 degrees Celsius. And you've seen the reasons for concern, whereby clearly anything above 2 degrees Celsius, it's for the delegations over here to decide whether that would be acceptable or not. I'm very grateful for this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pachauri. And with your presentation, you have remembered us what it is a very key principle to deal with this complex issue, the sense of urgency. Before to give the floor to former President Felipe Calderón, let me also say that we are here building one more bridge, the bridge between COP20 here in Lima and COP21 in Paris. So for that, let me thank you to His Excellency, the Minister of Foreign Affairs from France, Laurent Fabius. Thank you very much, my friend.